Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Happy Tuesday, and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am back in California. Got back on Saturday, and it was pretty uneventful. My flight to from Missoula to Salt Lake was great. My flight from Salt Lake to Sacramento was delayed by about an hour, but not a big deal. Got home. Hung out with the hubby. Well, I've been hanging out with the hubby. Got to see the puppies. And, little puppies. They're so sweet. Saw my dragons, and they're good. So everything is good. I'm back in California, which, of course, means no more recording in Giant Bear Studios. It has been dismantled. It is now back to being a cubby. So sad. But I am back to recording in my normal studio space, which is great. This is a product of two different states, though, this episode, because the interview was recorded in Montana, and the episode is being recorded in California, so you're still going to have the not-so-great connection of using my parents' landline for this interview. I apologize. We're getting close to being back to just one state interviews with both parts being done in the studio in California. So anyway, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I am speaking today with author Sadie Hoagland about her debut novel called Strange Children. Let me go ahead and give you the description of that book from the back of the book. Let's see. In a polygamous commune in the desert, a 14-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl fall in love and consummate that love, breaking religious law. They are caught, and a year later she gives birth to his father's child, while the boy commits murder 400 miles away, a crime that will slowly unravel the community. Told by 8 adolescent narrators, this is a story of how people use faith to justify cruelty and how redemption can come from unexpected places. Though seemingly powerless in the face of their fundamentalist religion, these strange children shift into the central framework of their world as they come of age. So, Strange Children by Sadie Hoagland. It is, as the description says, it's told by 8 adolescent narrators. The youngest is, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, 9. The oldest is 18 or 19. It is told from the perspective of several children who are still living in the community, as well as 2 who are living outside of the community, one of them being the description says 14, but I thought the book said he was 16, the boy that had the affair with the 12-year-old girl that causes him to be kicked out of the community. But it could be wrong. I could be remembering that incorrectly. At any rate, he's a teenager. She's 12. Their relationship is what gets him kicked out of their community, and then the story moves on from there. This story it's a page turner. It's compelling. It's not one of those it's not exactly lighthearted reading. It's not escapism, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's very intense at some points, but it is, as I said, compelling. I needed to find out what was going to happen with all of these 8 narrators. I needed to know how this community was going to affect them, what choices they were going to make, etc. And so, while at times it was a little difficult to read simply because these are children and their lives are very different, it was, as I said, very compelling. I came to want to know more about those characters, want to know how their stories turned out, etc. So that is just a little bit about Strange Children, again, by Sadie Hoagland. Let's go ahead and turn now to the interview with Sadie so she can tell more about the process of writing this particular book.
Hi, Sadie. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I am excited to have you here. We'll be talking about your book, Strange Children. Before we get to that book, though, if you would share a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So I'm a fiction writer and a professor. I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I have 2 small children and a dog. I love being in the outdoors, so being in Utah is really great for that. But I currently teach for the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, so I've gotten to experience the South a little bit as well. And I'm really excited to talk about Strange Children with you.
Yeah, I am as well. So you teach in Louisiana, but you're living in Salt Lake, is that correct?
For the moment, yes, just because we're all remote right now. So
okay. Makes sense. That makes sense. All right. In terms of the book, can you give an overview of the premise?
Yeah. So Strange Children follows a polygamous community, and the story starts when 2 young people of the community, Jeremiah, who's 16, and Emma, who's 12, who fall in love, and they consummate that love, and that sort of breaks their religious law. So Jeremiah is kicked out of the community and makes his way to a large city sort of as a boy on his own. Emma is married off to his father, so a year later, she gives birth to his father's child, and he commits a crime, which then comes back to sort of haunt the community and put a lot of external pressure on the community. And in the meantime, the community is kind of falling apart from a lot of internal strife.
Yes, that is definitely an overview. It kind of boils it down to all of its basic parts. So it's so much more complicated than that. What was your initial inspiration for the story?
So I grew up in Utah, and I grew up with a couple of different family stories. One of the larger family stories was about our polygamous ancestors. So I grew up in Utah in a very Mormon neighborhood, and we weren't Mormon. So our sort of family origin myth as to why we weren't Mormon was rooted in this polygamist wife who apparently got very fed up at one point with polygamy and left and took her children, which were my great-great-grandparents, or my great-great-grandmother with her. And so that was sort of our family story as to, this is how we ended up coming, how our family history kind of diverged from the history of the church, and it had to do with polygamy. The actual little story is that the first wife asked the husband, my ancestor asked her husband for curtains, new curtains for her home, and the new curtains were given to the third wife, the newest wife, the youngest wife. And so that was apparently the straw that broke the camel's back, as the family legend tells it. So I'd always been sort of really interested in polygamy because it seemed really formative to my own childhood and sort of this narrative that I had. But then there was also a polygamous family that lived in our neighborhood. And my friend and I would ride our bikes over, and we would watch the kids. The kids weren't allowed to talk to us. They dressed like they were in pioneer times. And they had livestock in their sort of suburban yard, and they would be working and taking care of this livestock. And their lives looked so fundamentally different than my very suburban American childhood that I was just sort of fascinated. And then as I sort of decided to become a writer in my young 20s and was living here and working, was living in Utah and working for different magazines and ski resorts and things like that, polygamy was just always in the news. It still is, but not as much as it was then because of the sort of the drama with Warren Jeffs and everything happening. So it was just sort of constantly in my face. So I just began to think about the experiences of the children I had seen when I was a child, what it must be like to be in those communities. I was really interested in the idea that we always think, oh, I would never live that life. But I was very much aware that, you know, if I'd been raised like that as a child, I probably would live that life. So I was really interested in kind of trying to find a sense of empathy for people living in that kind of really isolated community that takes so many departures from our current culture. So it just kind of became a question of curiosity, and then little things happened along the way to sort of push that curiosity. Like my brother, who is a lawyer in Utah, told me one day that blood atonement is a question that you have to address if you want to be, if you're taking a survey to be on a jury in Utah. You have to state whether you believe in blood atonement or not, which is a very old Mormon doctrine rooted in the same kind of documents as polygamy, which basically says you can spill someone's blood in order to help them atone for their sins. So it just became like, wow, this could be so interesting to explore this world. And then I started with the characters, and I thought I was writing a short story, and it just turned into 4 short stories, and then it just kept going.
It is time to take our first break of the podcast now that you've heard a little bit more about Strange Children and Sadie's writing of this story, how it came to be. So let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about those initial short stories. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Sadie Hoagland about her debut novel, Strange Children. Let's return to that interview.
And were those initial 4 short stories from the points of view of 4 different children? Because it is told from multiple points of view. So what were those initial short stories?
Yeah, so the initial short stories are pretty much, they've changed a little bit in their structure. But the 2 sisters, Emma, who's the one who commits the sort of sin in the beginning with Jeremiah, and her sister Anna Lou were the first ones. And then their brother Levi was another one of the first ones. And then the character Manti, who is my personal favorite character, who's kind of a changeling figure, who lives on the edges of the community, a very strange child, was another one.
Okay. And can you talk about writing it from the points of view of, I think it's 8, right? Different children?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And talk about just your decision to come from that many points of view, kind of the backstory of how that came about.
Sure. So I think just because of the way it started as these kind of what I thought was linked stories, I had these different voices already. I think what I decided about keeping them and even creating a few more was that I was really interested in when you see images of people in polygamous communities in the media, you see them as large groups of sort of anonymous women and children for the most part. They wear these sort of pastel colored plain long dresses with long sleeves and kind of poofy shoulders. They have a very distinct braid, so they all have this kind of uniformity to them. And there is, I think, because there is such a lack of contact between the media and individual members of the community, at least while they're in the community, sometimes we hear from them when they leave, I felt like there was a real loss of any kind of individual experience. So I wanted to think about the individual subjectivities of people in these communities. And so that became really important to me, that these characters would have their own voice and they would get to tell their own story, and they would be able to describe for the reader their identities in relation to their communities. And I'm, as a writer in general, really interested in identity and narrative, which I can talk more about later too. But so that was part of it. And then the other part of it was, in the in the polygamist realm, there's a tradition of testimony and bearing testimony, and it's sort of a tradition of reifying your faith in a public manner. But in the sense of the greater view of polygamy, and when we think of testimony, we often think of it in a legal sense. So I was really interested in those two kinds of meanings of testimony, and the way that inevitably when we tell our truth and we give our testimony, it's going to veer from someone else's testimony of the same event or the same moment in a community. So I was really interested in the slippage between those, and even just the opportunities for character development within that. So Emma, for example, is a very strong-willed character. She's just like a very sure of herself. I'm doing this. I'm very pious. And she likes to manipulate her knowledge of the sort of doctrines to kind of meld with her own desires and her own goals for herself. And her sister has a very different viewpoint of what she is and what she's doing. So that kind of difference between how Emma views herself and how Anna Lou, her sister, views Emma was really interesting to me, and to be able to play with that. Especially in a book that, all these characters are coming of age as well and changing by the minute. So I thought that would be especially salient to that kind of development.
And I think you did a really good job of making them complete characters and giving them their own voices, but also having their points of view come across so that they weren't kind of caricatures of what people might expect in a community like this. Did you ever find that kind of difficult to find that line between, some of the sort of stereotypes that readers might have, as opposed to how you wanted to portray the characters in the community?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was really interested and I think maybe kind of speaks to your question is the kind of the way that they speak, and they have, like, some of them speak differently from each other, but they are all in the same community, and they all have, a very sort of influenced by the Bible and Book of Mormon lexicon, but they also speak in a very rural lexicon. And so I think I was very conscious of trying not to make that too cartoony, and also trying to make it its own thing too, because this community is a fictional community. And I wanted it to kind of have a sense of otherworldliness, even as it borrowed from realities of real polygamous communities. I also wanted it to be its own place. So I think in terms of the way they speak, I definitely thought about that. And I just definitely wanted them to have their own histories, but also their own desires. And then what unfolds in the community is something I think is very different than any kind of reality, because the children sort of gain more and more agency as the book continues. So I tried to just be as specific as I could with things like the sensory details, but also with just thinking about the kinds of ways that they would use language and reuse the language of the adults in their lives. So I don't know if I pulled it off.
Yeah, I would think that you did in a lot of ways. What do you hope that readers might take away from the book?
That's a really good question. I definitely want readers to feel a sense of hope. There is darkness in the book, that is inevitable. It is a book largely about a community very vulnerable to systemic abuse. And yet there is escape for a character. There is sort of a renewal and revision of the community into hopefully something more, to a more moderate version of itself towards the end of the book. I think I also really want people to kind of have that experience that I did when I was young, where you sort of really stop to think about people that live really different lives than us as individuals, and have that kind of empathy of really just curiosity of what that would be like to grow up like that. and to not feel so confident that we would be so incredibly different if we were in that situation. I think that's definitely, there's also a sense too, as I was starting to write this, it's not as much anymore. There was a lot of fetishizing of the polygamous communities. Like there was that Big Love show, there was the Sister Wives show. There was just a lot of kind of cultural gazing at the communities, and I felt like that was something to be addressed as well, to kind of start conversations about what are these communities really like, and what is life like for the people that leave these communities. That's probably one of the crises in the book that gets highlighted, is when Jeremiah is kicked out of the community. He's a very young, he's like 16. He's a young kid and he's on his own, and that tribe of young men exists. It's a chronic problem. It's a real problem. And they, Utahns call them lost boys. They don't like to be called that, but that it is a population of people that we don't really have excellent resources for, and we should.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, it's one of those cracks that children could fall through in this regard.
It is time for the second break of the podcast. When we come back, Sadie will be talking about some of the different types of research she did for this story. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. If you somehow just walked into an empty room and this podcast was playing, I am speaking today with author Sadie Hoagland about her debut novel, Strange Children. Let's go ahead and return to that interview.
What types of research did you do for the book?
So I watched documentaries with people that had left the community. I read a lot of religious documentation and doctrine and sermons, and some very dark sort of realities of current polygamous communities, both from the kind of surviving victims, but also from the sort of standpoint of those that preach and believe in them. And then at one point I got on Facebook and found some young men that had left the community and asked them if I could get together with them and ask some questions. And so I went down to Colorado City, which is it's actually two towns on the border of Arizona and Utah. This is after Warren Jeffs had left for Texas and then been arrested. So the community was a little bit disorganized at that point. But a young man who was living in an abandoned motel at the edge of the town, who had been kicked out of the community, agreed to sort of be my tour guide and took me around and kind of explained what his childhood was like, what his exile had been like and was like in the current moment. And that was super fascinating. I would say, like, I was still interested in creating this fictional world, but everything that I learned just seemed to make that world richer in some way. And just even the setting and learning about some of the changes that the community had undergone in this. He was basically a kid. He was 19 in his lifetime. Was really fascinating. So I also recommend to anyone that's interested in this topic, there's a private investigator who works out of St. George named Sam Brower, and he has a book called A Prophet's Prey. He also helped John Krakauer write Under the Banner of Heaven, but he's probably one of the most important people working as an advocate for polygamous families, both legally and socially and emotionally, and helping people get out if they want to get out. But his book, The Prophet's Prey, is really, really, it's well done and it's super informative. So that would be another resource I would definitely recommend to people who are interested in.
Thank you for that. That sounds really interesting. And the tour and being able to have that access must have been just so helpful in terms of creating this community that you created. For the characters, I know that some of them started out as short stories, but do you have them pretty well fleshed out before you start writing, or do they tend to evolve as you write? Did any of them surprise you as you wrote?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I do feel like they evolved as I wrote, partly because they were coming of age, partly because of the way that this project started. I really resisted that I was writing a novel for quite a long time. I just kept thinking, I keep writing these little vignettes, and now, oh wait, maybe I'll write a novella, and then finally I succumbed. But I do think that they are, they just kind of told, but because they're first-person narrations, and because, I was sort of a conduit for their kind of monologic style, I felt like I was learning about them as I was writing, and seeing how they would interpret certain events in the community, how they would remember and write and think about these, and sort of speak, because there's an oral sense to their narrations about these events. And I was super surprised in some instances. Probably the most surprising characters for me were the turn that Emma makes at the end was probably the most. I just remember writing that one night at like 9:30 at night, and I just remember being like, oh my gosh, this is what she's gonna do. And I remember being pretty emotional about it. Like, this is, because she's this character, this is the trajectory she's on. And so just like that realization was pretty surprising to me, which sounds funny, but I know writers talk about that all the time, like the characters kind of surprising them. So that definitely happened with her. And then the character of Manti too is just always a surprise, because he's I really like the trickster figure in myth and literature, and to me he's the trickster of the book, and there's always some slippage in his character. He's neither good nor evil, but he just kind of exists in this space, and so writing him was always a surprise and always a lot of fun.
There's a character in the book called Haley, and I don't want to give too much away about the book, but what can you say about that character?
Yeah, so that character to me became really important. She was written probably one of the final characters that got added into the story, because she becomes important to Jeremiah in his life after the community. But because of her situation, she's also in a position to see the community from the outside. And as I continued to write and build this world up, it was intense. And I won't say the points of view, because there's so many of them, were confining, but at the same time, I felt like I needed a point of view that was able to see the community from the outside in the same way that the reader would see it from the outside. And to be able to think about, I'm really interested in cycles of redemption in work, to think about her personal journey through the narrative as a cycle of redemption or forgiveness, and to think of it as not revenge, but sort of making her way into the narrative of a really, obviously dramatic turn in her life. And so I think for me, she just becomes this important kind of haunting of the narrative of the sense of the other. Like the community is so insular, but this other world exists out there. And for the community, the other world is a threat, and vice versa. For the other world, the community itself is a threat. So I think thinking about that and really thinking about the juxtaposition between predator and victim, which I think is another sort of main theme of the book, where you have Jeremiah as a character acting in a predatory manner, and yet he is also a victim in the book, in my mind too, because he is this child who is exiled and left completely on his own and really vulnerable, as readers will find, to all kinds of potential abuses. So I think she became just this kind of way for me to do that and to kind of nod to the outside world.
I think there's also a juxtaposition, kind of the same sides of two coins between the characters of Mercy Ann and Cadence. One is an outsider who comes into the community. One is a person who grew up in the community who is taken away from that community. Can you talk a little bit about just those two sides of the same coin and how the different perspectives shaped some of that narrative?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really nice, no one's ever put it that way. It's a really nice way to think about that. I like that, that those two characters, as kind of like just these kind of, two sides of a coin. That's a great way to put that, Sarah. Those characters, I think Cadence represents, for me, the way that communities like this can also be havens for the vulnerable, and she's a very vulnerable young woman who enters into the community because she basically has nowhere else to go. And she comes at it from a place of like, hey, this is a little weird, but it's a lot better than being homeless. And so she kind of has this way of, she's just trying to be accepted. She's really trying to survive as a woman. And so I think she kind of brings in the aspect of thinking about these communities as havens, which I don't think a lot of people would think of them as, but like any cult, they have a way that, the vulnerable can be preyed on in the spans as she's brought into the community. And Mercy Ann is in that space of, again, like we have this idea of when we get people out of these communities of feeling as if we've saved them, and Mercy Ann very much does not feel saved. She feels, taken and torn apart from her siblings, and having her whole world kind of cut in half between the before she left and the after. She's sort of constantly catching up on what life is like in this new culture, in this kind of vast American culture, and still being an outsider. And I think it just, both of the characters serve to show us like the chasm between the two worlds and how large it really is.
Time for our final break of the podcast. When we come back, we will be talking about any autobiographical elements that Sadie includes in her writing. And I realize that I tend to break at this point a lot right before the autobiographical question, which is not on purpose. It just sort of happens to be where things fall. There's probably an algorithm that would explain that, but for me, we're just going with it. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Sadie Hoagland.
You mentioned your family story, kind of not exactly an origin story, but that family lore. Are there any autobiographical elements that you like to include in your writing?
Usually, yes. Like in my short story collection, I always tell everyone like the setting of every story is basically the street I grew up on because it has a lot of suburban set stories. And so in my mind, when I picture writing those stories, I picture writing, and for some reason my aunt's house is always like the house I picture that the characters are living in. So usually there's some element of my life or my past that gets incorporated in this. I think for this particular piece, it was the images that I had seen both through the media, but also as a child. That memory is just like seared into my brain of watching these polygamous kids. And that scene is actually in the book. At the beginning of the book, Emma talks about kids coming to watch them and like be voyeurs basically. And that's what I think of. I think of my friend and I there sitting there on our bikes, just having ridden our bikes specifically over to their house to watch, just stand there and watch them. Just totally unaware of how rude that probably was. But so that's definitely in there. And then I grew up in Utah. I'm very familiar with the landscape and the desert landscape that this book takes place in. So I would say that's the other part of it, is just kind of a connection to the land, the plants, the way the sky looks, the red dirt, like all of that feels sort of ingrained in me from my growing up here. And this was something I wanted to be writ large in the book because it is such an extraordinary landscape.
Yeah. Are you working on a new project now?
I am. I have a second novel that is actually nearing completion, which is exciting. It's through like one editing phase, and hopefully we'll have some news soon about its appearance in the world. And it's called Circle of Animals, which is a reference to, that's what zodiac means in Greek, is Circle of Animals. And it tells the story of a young woman, Sky, who's actually, this is a California story, so maybe you'll have to have me back on. But she's in Marin County, and she's in landscape architecture, particularly stone design, which is a really male-dominated industry. And she is, at the beginning of the book, she's sexually assaulted at her workplace. And at the same time, her sort of mother, who's this remnant of a 1960s California counterculture hippie, her mother disappears. And because her mother is this kind of strange woman who doesn't always conform to things like, leaving voicemails and checking in, Sky doesn't really know if she's missing or if she's just kind of being irresponsible. But she decides, because of what's happening at work, to take some time off and actually look for her mother. And in the process, she finds out all sorts of things about her mother's past and her estranged grandmother. And the book kind of thinks about California culture from the 1950s on, but also it thinks about being a woman in different generations and different occupations and different spaces. And it's kind of a mystery because she's looking for her mother, all sorts of things happen. So.
All right. And yes, of course, I would love to have you back on, whether it's or not.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you have been writing in various capacities for a while, and you didn't set out to write a novel, but you did. But when did you start thinking about writing for publication, or was there anything that precipitated that decision?
Well, I always wrote as a child, and I would write these little plays and make my friends act in them, and I would, write these little novels like in quotation marks that were like 4 pages, on handwritten on like notepad paper. But I just always was interested in it, and then teachers were always really positive about my writing. But like so many young people, it was like people tell you, oh, that's not a career, right? You can't do that. you can't make money doing that. So I actually became a psychology major in college, but I took every single creative writing class offered at the school, and then finally at the very end, I was with one of my creative writing teachers, and they're like, "Why don't you just do this? Like you could really do this." And so that kind of opened up. By the time I left college, I was quite sure that's what I was going to do. So I started writing for magazines, and I did that for 3 years or so before deciding I would go for sort of my MFA and then eventually a PhD, and actually sort of work and write to try to get publications in literary journals and things like that. But yeah, it took a while to get the courage to kind of believe in oneself enough to send your work out and think it's of value and think that others might be interested in it.
I can imagine. So then from that experience, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
I do. I would say to keep writing. There's that lovely line in Annie Dillard's The Writing Life where she quotes Michelangelo talking to his apprentice, and he says, "Draw, Antonio, draw, and do not stop." And I really think that's part of it. You just have to keep writing and keep reading. But I also think, and I teach this way a lot, I talked about how one of my main interests is narrative and identity. So when I teach my students, I talk a lot about paying deep attention to the world, not just in terms of the sensory experience of being alive and the kinds of little things that you could notice that you could put into a narrative that would just make the writing pop and shine and sizzle, but also the kinds of stories and narratives that we're telling ourselves about other people and about our own identities. So I talk to them a lot about sort of, you have micro narratives, you have, like I had maybe an idea that I can't be a writer because A, B, or C. And just really taking a moment to question those narratives that you either inherited or you formed over the years about what you can and cannot do, and really interrogating them and making the narrative about your life and your identity that you want to have and that are healing for you and that are productive for you. So I think for me, like, this is the way I think about teaching writing, and the kind of advice I like to give authors is also just thinking about, not just the act of writing, but the act of being a writer and inhabiting the world with a sense of empathy and compassion and vision. Another exercise I always like to tell students is like, okay, so you're driving in your car and someone cuts you off. So you have this option where you can just like swear and yell or honk, get frustrated, or you can take a breath and just imagine, why are they doing that? Why are they driving like that? Are they going to be like late for work for their third and final time and that's the last straw? Or, are they on their way to the hospital because their partner's in labor? Like, what is happening here? And so kind of this idea of creating story as a way to connect with people and with our communities.
Yeah, I really like that. Thank you. When you take time to read for yourself, what types of genres and specific authors do you turn toward?
Oh my gosh. So this has changed so much in the pandemic, I have to say. So traditionally, I would just answer this question with like my favorite authors, which are, it's like Toni Morrison, Angela Carter. I love Karen Russell. I love sort of just really poetic, lyrical, even elements of the tale. I love Jasmine Ward's work. I love Brian Evanson, who's kind of this dark, gothic-y Western writer, also from Utah. So I just love texts that are really language-based. That yes, there's a story, but we're really just falling in love at the sentence level with just how things are expressed and the kinds of details being used and the kinds of just surprises in the language. However, I've always liked mysteries and thrillers as well. And I like to kind of just fall into that escapism of a story as well. And that's become like a lot more important during the pandemic. So now I just have been reading Celeste Ng. I really appreciate her work because not only is it super well written, but it's like she just writes some page turners. Like Everything I Never Told You, such a page turner. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm really interested in talking to people about how their reading has changed during the pandemic. But it's funny because I do feel like I just want a little bit more of that escapism than I've traditionally wanted.
I completely understand that. In fact, while you were talking about Toni Morrison, I was thinking, yeah, I love Toni Morrison, but that's not what I wanted to be reading during the pandemic. You need, I just needed something a little bit different. So I completely understand. In terms of your internet presence, if you have a website, can you direct people towards the website, and then also what social media platforms you're available on?
Yeah, sure. So my website is sadiehoagland.com, and you can also contact me through the website. I get the emails. I love to hear from people. And then I have a public Facebook page. It's just Sadie Hoagland. And then on Instagram, I'm at Sadie Hoagland. And Twitter's the same thing, at Sadie Hoagland, just my full name, SADIEHOAGLAND. I can spell my name usually. So I was trying to remember to go slow.
Sadie, is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you were hoping to cover or highlight during our time together?
Sure. I guess the two other things would be, so I have a short story collection too called American Grief in 4 Stages. And it came out in the end of 2019. And I think it's a book that it started for me a lot of really wonderful conversations with others, but even since COVID, I think it's become even more a connection point between me and readers and other authors. So if people are interested in thinking about grief and trauma and language, I would love for them to reach out and talk to me about that. And then the second is that I'm writing for Medium, which is a lot of fun, and it's a great writing community. So if you have listeners that are writers, or if you have listeners that are interested in reading, like it's kind of blogging as a novelist, they can look me up on Medium as well.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you as well for taking time to talk to me today about Strange Children, but also about some of your other writings. And I just really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. It was a lovely conversation.
Thank you once again to Sadie for joining me to talk about Strange Children. If you are a fan of fictionalized versions of real life events, or books that are based on events that have happened in certain forms, then you should definitely check out Strange Children. It is certainly, as I said, a compelling read. It really gives you a different look at a polygamist type community such as is pictured in this book, because you are hearing it from some of the most innocent members of that community and how their lives are formed, how their ways of thinking are formed by being a part of the community, of growing up in that community, and how it's really the only thing that they know, and for them it's normal until they experience the world outside. And then I can only imagine how difficult it must be to either assimilate, or if you are moved into that culture, trying to assimilate with the outside world, or also just to kind of make that world make sense with the world that you've been brought up in. So I think Sadie did a really good job of that. I've also, it's kind of silly to giggle at a book like this. I'm not giggling at the content, but this is another one. If you remember from a few interviews ago when I was talking about the book The Dead Husband, that is a funny title to use in certain sentences, as is this title, because I emailed the publicist to say, hey, I got Strange Children in the mail today. When you read those stories about how you used to be able to mail kids for, I don't remember what do those stories say, like $5 or something, or a nickel? I don't know. You could mail your kids. I really need to look into that and see if it's true. But no, I got Strange Children in the mail, and I took Strange Children to Montana with me, and I talked to my mom about the Strange Children. So you can put it into all kinds of fun sentences, but you should put it on your TBR list if you are interested in this type of novel, and if you're interested in learning more about this type of community from a very specific point of view. And of course, it is a fictionalized community, but there you have it. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I hope that you will join me for the next episode. I have a returning author coming back to the podcast. That author is Kevin D. Miller. He joined me the first time to talk about his debut novel called Heart of Steel, and this time he is talking about his new novel, White Skies, Black Mingo. It is another story inspired by parts of his family's history. So join me for that interview when Kevin returns. Again, hope you're having a great Tuesday. Hope that you are finding plenty of stuff to do this week. I am noticing that I didn't mention at the beginning of the podcast, but I am back in California. I did mention that. But today I went to the pharmacy and got both my flu shot and my first pneumonia shot. And my arms are sore, of course. They always are. I've been trying to stretch them as much as possible. But also, I'm just tired. I think I may go to bed really early tonight and blame it on the flu and pneumonia shots, right? Good as excuse as any to take my book to bed and go to bed earlier than usual. If you are a fan of this podcast, please do me the favor, the honor, what have you, of leaving a review, whether written or starred. Either way helps to get the podcast out to more people, such as yourselves, who hopefully love books as much as you do. Also, if you are not yet following on social media, please do that. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Would love to hear from you. Let me know what you're reading. Tell me what books you're looking forward to that are coming out soon, etc. Thank you again for listening. Hope that your day has plenty of time for you to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.